Wrote his first book on homebrewing in about 1970. There really wasn't any information, at least in this country, on how to make great beer as a homebrewer. Homebrewing was illegal, actually, at that point in time, on the federal level. And many states, actually, it was still illegal. Just recently, there's maybe one or two states left where it's still not legal to homebrew. But Fred wrote this book, and I got my hands on it right around 1970 when it first came out, and I just had started brewing. And it was really the first exposure to a lot of these beer styles from Europe that were classic beer styles, Dortmunders and Pilsners and all sorts of styles. That the books up until that point were really English written, and it was based on making English style ales and generally not great quality ones, but inexpensive ones. So this was a big eye-opener for me. And then shortly thereafter, this book came out, The Big Book of Brewing, which was an English publication. But it was really the first time science had been sort of brought down to the homebrewing level. And it talked about how to make your own malt extracts and mashing and yeast culturing and all sorts of things. So with these two books, I really became a much better homebrewer and a lot more serious about it. I moved up to Chico in 1972, so I had just been brewing a few years. And I brought up my homebrew supplies and continued my homebrewing hobby at that point. I really couldn't buy malt. There was no place in Chico. There was one drugstore on the Esplanade that sold Pabst or the Blue Ribbon malt extract. Pabst later bought it, but the Blue Ribbon malt extract and some other sort of crude homebrewing supplies. So you really couldn't make great beer without traveling to San Francisco or to Los Angeles. And so I was actually making some of my own malts. So this tub shows I was making wheat malt and some barley malt myself, and I was making roasted malts in my oven. I bought a washer combo dryer thinking I was going to turn it into a little malting machine. I never did that, but I thought it was a great thought. You soak the grain, which a washing machine does, and you dry it, which a dryer does. So I thought that would be a great thing to convert. So it sat in my yard for a number of years, but never made it to fruition. But I did end up opening the homebrew shop, which at the point when I opened it, it was on Broadway upstairs. 336 Broadway, which was right next to Toad Hall. That was the next building over. And it was in a very small little room. It actually had been a hotel, been the Grand Hotel, I think. It had been an old hotel in Chico before it was turned into a little mall. And I opened this little facility. I sold supplies for homebrewers and home winemakers. And I did that for a few years and started to get more inspired about making beer. And I was still a fairly avid homebrewer. And I got together with a friend of my brother's and decided to start talking about opening a brewery. As I mentioned, homebrewing was illegal, and Alan Cranston actually got the federal law passed in '78, and Jimmy Carter signed it into law in 1979. And I went to my very first homebrewing conference, which was in Oakland in 1979, 1978. And I went and visited Fritz Maytag at the Anchor Brewery when I did that. And he, at that point, was operating a 50-barrel brew house under the freeway. And the Anchor Brewery had been a very, very old American brewery that was on its last legs. And when Fritz bought it in 1965, they were selling the old wooden barrels for bridge fare to get home. They were pretty much out of money. And Fritz paid $5,000, and he bought 51% of the ownership of the Anchor Brewery and continued to invest in the plant and learn how to make beer. He didn't know anything about brewing beer. He'd been in wine a little bit when he was going to school. But he learned about brewing and realized that beer was terrible and tried to figure out how to make it saleable. They weren't bottling at the time. They were just making a very little bit of beer. They were brewing every month. I think 1 50-barrel batch a month when they purchased the place. You can't learn a lot when you're making one batch and waiting a month to brew your next one. But he pumped a lot of money and energy into the brewery, and eventually it became a great success. But I went and visited him in that year, 1978. And I was inspired enough that I went and visited this guy, and his name was Jack McAuliffe, and he was the one who sort of showed the way from home brewing to commercial brewing. In 1977, he opened the first new American craft brewery, and that term hadn't been coined at that point, but microbrewery or boutique brewery, there were lots of names that were thrown about for the years. But he was the one who went from home brewing to commercial brewing on a very, very small scale on a very small budget, and starting from scratch. He spent something around $30,000 or so, and opened this little brewery in Sonoma, California. And I went and visited him a few times as a home brewer when I had my homebrew shop. And we went over there and did a little pilgrimage and saw what he had done, and it was not very sophisticated, and it was basically glorified homebrewing equipment he had built himself. This was his work cooler and his mash tun. A lot of his equipment was made from old 55-gallon stainless steel drums he picked up from salvage yards, and his refrigeration equipment he built himself. These were his fermenters. And a little refrigeration plank he put together to cool his beer, and it was all off of cast-off equipment. An old bottle washer he found in a soft drink plant, and I eventually bought the same model of bottle washer, which was made out of battleship decking from World War II, and truthfully was. When they had surplus steel after the war, they turned in all sorts of things, and the bottle washer was one of them. So after I saw what he had done, I thought, that's something I think I could pull off. So I went back to Butte College. I'd gone to Butte and Chico State and studied chemistry, and then back to Butte College and started taking welding and fabrication and refrigeration and all sorts of other classes I thought would be helpful to open this brewery. And after I saw the New Albion Brewery was seemingly thriving, I sold my business, and I started writing a business plan to open a small brewery. I think I'll stop at this point and talk a little bit about the beer we're going to drink, and I will come back to the story here in a minute. I'm not sure how Michael's doing getting ready to serve, but